a father could return to his room in the Minsk ghetto and find the bed still warm, the bowl still on the table. But his wife and children already gone. Minsk still had windows, stairways, workrooms, and winter skies. But under Nazi Germany, Jewish families were pushed into hunger, papers, forced labour, hidden rooms, deportation roads, and killing sites like Maly Trostenets. This is not only a story of death, but of how ordinary homes, names and memories were turned into T-SOS. Tonight we follow the Minsk ghetto from its first closed doors to the empty rooms left behind. Sure, before you settle in, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if this kind of slow, grounded history is something you truly want more of. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. What time it is there. It always feels meaningful to know that people in different places are sharing the same dark, careful journey. Now lower the lights. Let the room become still. And let's step into this story together tonight. In the summer of 1941, Minsk still looked like a city holding on to ordinary life. The shop doors were still there, the courtyards still held benches, and the worn stone steps still led into rooms where families had eaten and slept for years. A Jewish family near its doorway could recognize every nearby corner, from the bakery window to the schoolbook wall. Yet the street had begun to feel watched. German soldiers had entered Minsk after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and their arrival changed more than boots on pavement. It changed the meaning of names, papers, addresses, and faces. A father who had once walked to the muhmak with a bag under his arm now stood in the doorway holding documents that had gone soft from being opened often. His wife stayed half inside the room, one hand on the frame, one on their child's shoulder. The child did not understand why the adult spoke in lower voices. He noticed that his father looked toward the street before stepping out, and that his mother no longer let him run ahead toward the courtyard gate. Two German soldiers stood near a corner where neighbours once stopped to talk about bread and work. The street had not moved, but everyone moved through it differently. Before the occupation, Jewish life in Minsk was not a separate idea in a history book. It was made of teachers, tailors, shopkeepers, doctors, grandmothers, schoolchildren, and tired parents carrying baskets upstairs. A neighbour might borrow salt, a child might be sent to fetch water, and an old man might sit near a window because his legs hurt. These ordinary details made a community. The first damage often came through things that looked official. Notices were posted, movement was restricted, property was watched, and people learned that a wrong answer or missing paper could bring danger. The orders did not need to explain their final purpose to create fear. They only needed to make Jewish families understand that the city no longer treated them as people with normal rights. A mother could still place bread on the table, but even that small act carried tension. She might cut each piece carefully, listen to footsteps in the stairwell, and glance toward the folded papers near her husband's hand. A father might pretend to be calm while checking whether the stamp on one document was clear enough to show if a soldier stopped him outside. The room remained the same size, but it felt less private each day. There was fear in ordinary objects now. A coat by the door meant someone might need to leave quickly. A bag under the bed meant someone had begun thinking about what could be carried. A birth certificate, a work note, or a household paper could become more important than a meal. Minsk itself became harder to read. Some neighbours still nodded, but others looked away too quickly, and the difference mattered. A closed shop might mean someone had been arrested or warned. A quiet courtyard did not mean peace, because people were learning to keep children inside, and voices low. Familiar places were filled with new meanings. The Jewish families of Minsk had not yet all been sealed behind the barriers of the ghetto, but the walls were already forming in behaviour, rules and glances. A man could still stand in front of his own building, but he might already feel like a guest waiting to be expelled. A woman could still look at her own window from the yard and wonder how long it would remain hers. The city had started to turn its back. From a distance, occupation can sound like a military fact, a date on a map, or a sentence in a report. Inside a sound household, the sound of a drawer opened for papers before sunrise, the sight of a child being pulled back from the door, and the weight of silence whenever boots passed outside. Dinner could end without anyone finishing because a rumour had crossed the building. It was history entering the room. The danger grew because no one knew which rule would matter tomorrow. Obedience might protect a person for one morning, and a work paper might help at one checkpoint, but neither could change the purpose of the system moving around them. Nazi Germany did not enter Minsk simply to govern a conquered city. It entered with a racial policy that pushed Jewish people toward isolation, exploitation, and death. For the family at the doorway, all of this still had to be understood through small signs. A soldier at the corner, a notice on a wall, a neighbour's mouth tightened before he spoke. A father's hand was folding the same paper until the crease nearly tore. By the time the path toward the Minsk ghetto became clear, the old life had already been wounded. Jewish families were still standing in their streets, still recognising their homes, still hearing the same doors and steps. But their place in the city had been taken from them, piece by piece. What had once been normal life was becoming a waiting room for something worse. The familiar city had become a trap with open doors. Minsk had not yet become a sealed ghetto, but Jewish families had already been pushed into fear inside the streets that once belonged to their daily lives. The story now moves from those doorways into the cramped space where Nazi Germany forced people into rooms, staircases, and courtyards that could not hold them. A home built for one family would soon contain strangers, hunger, guarded exits, and air so crowded that even breathing felt controlled. The Minsk ghetto did not begin as a place that looked entirely new. It was made from streets people already knew, from buildings they had passed for years, and from staircases worn smooth by ordinary feet. That familiarity made the change harder to accept, because the same doors and walls remained while the meaning of living behind them was taken away. A prison had been made from a home. A family might be pushed into a room where another family had already spread blankets against the wall. Bundles sat under a table, coats hung from nails, and a small cooking pot rested near a stove that too many people needed to share. Someone's child slept near the door because there was no other space, while an old woman sat upright on a chair because lying down meant taking up room from others. The apartment had been built for one household, but now it had to hold several lives at once. The staircases became crowded and was fully light. People carried pails of water, scraps of food, bedding, and whatever clothing they had managed to keep. A boy might press his back against the wall to let adults pass, holding his breath as tired bodies brushed close to him. Even moving from one floor to another could make a person feel watched. In the courtyards, the old rhythm of daily life was gone. These spaces had once held small talk, laundry, repair work, and neighbours calling from windows, but now they were filled with people who had no proper place inside. Men stood with collars turned up, women held bags against their coats, and children stayed near adults because every open space felt temporary. The windows above looked dark even during the day. At the exits, guards made the truth of the ghetto clear. A street beyond the gate might be only a few steps away, but those steps no longer belonged to the people trapped inside. Movement could be refused, punished, or allowed only for work under guard, and a person could see the outside city without being allowed to enter it. The crowding itself became another way to control them. Nazi ghettos were used to separate Jewish people from the rest of the population, control movement, seize property, organize forced labor, and prepare for further persecution and killing. In Minsk, this meant the old city was cut into spaces where Jewish life could be compressed, watched, and weakened. A home was no longer simply a home, because every room now carried the pressure of orders made outside it. People did not just live there. They waited there, waiting shaped everything. A father might stand near the doorway looking at the guards post beyond the courtyard and understand that locking his own door no longer protected anyone. A mother might keep a small cloth bag near the wall, not because she knew where the family would be sent, but because having something ready was easier than sitting empty-handed. Children learned to read adult faces before asking for water or bread. Humiliation arrived in ordinary ways. A family that had once eaten alone now divided food whilst strangers tried not to look too closely. A woman who had once cleaned her own table had to wait while another household used the corner near the stove. People still tried to speak politely and make space for the elderly, but crowding wore down patience and shame together. Rumours moved quickly through the buildings. A shout near the gate could pass from one landing to another before anyone understood what had happened. Someone heard that new papers were needed, someone else heard that workers would be counted, and another person said a street had been searched before dawn. People waited because there was nothing else they were allowed to do. The ghetto did not only trap bodies, it trapped time. Each day could be spent looking for water, finding a little food, sharing a stove, listening for orders, and keeping a child from crying too loudly. The future did not arrive as a plan, only as a threat that had not shown its full shape. By then, the old Minsk had almost disappeared for the people inside. The bakery corner, the school route, the neighbour's window, and the market path still existed beyond the new limits, but they no longer formed a free life. Inside the Minsk ghetto, families were packed into rooms and courtyards where privacy, movement, and air itself seemed rationed. The cage had been built from streets they still recognised. The Minsk ghetto turned familiar streets into a crowded prison where families lost space, privacy, and the simple right to move through their own city. From that suffocating closeness, the story moves into the rooms and kitchens where hunger began to shape every hour of the day. Soon a mother would stand over a thin pot of water and break dark bread so carefully that her children might not notice how little food was left. Inside the Minsk ghetto, hunger did not arrive as one dramatic moment. It settled into rooms slowly, through smaller pieces of bread, thinner soup, colder mornings, and longer looks at empty shelves. A kitchen that once belonged to one family now had to serve too many people, with one stove, a few bowls, and hands that waited their turn without saying much. The table became the place where everyone understood what could not be said. A mother might stand over a pot that held more water than food. She stirred it anyway, because stirring made it look like something was being prepared, and preparation helped the children believe the day still had order. On the table lay a few dark pieces of bread, cut from a loaf already too small for the number of mouths in the room. Her fingers moved slowly when she divided them. The children watched her hands. One child looked down at the bowl, another looked at the bread, and the smallest waited for the mother's face before deciding whether to smile. She might break one piece into two uneven parts, then turn one part slightly, so it seemed larger from where the child sat. A parent could still practice tenderness, even when tenderness had almost nothing left to give. The ghetto made food into a daily calculation. A spoonful more for the child meant a spoonful less for someone old. A crust saved for later meant someone had to pretend not to be hungry now. A father returning from outside might place a small scrap on the table and avoid explaining how little he had found, because the sight of it already explained enough. Crowding made hunger worse. People shared rooms where cooking smells did not mean there would be enough for everyone, and the steam from a pot could draw several pairs of eyes. A neighbour might cough behind a curtain. An old woman might hold her bowl with both hands, and a child might lick the edge of a spoon long after the soup was gone. Nobody needed to announce that food had become too important. Life in ghettos often brought hunger, disease, cold, a shortage of medicine, and forced labour. These were not separate problems, because each one made the others harder to survive. A hungry body became weaker against illness. A cold room made sickness linger. And a person forced to work could return with no strength left to stand in a food line. The body was worn down before the next order even arrived. This was one of the quiet cruelties of Nazi control. Death did not only come through shootings, deportations, or massacres. It also came through making the community weaker each day, taking away space, food, heat, medicine, and the chance to live like human beings. By the time greater violence came, many people had already been pushed close to collapse. In the small kitchen, that larger system appeared as a thin meal. The mother might scrape the bottom of the pot carefully, not because anything real remained there, but because the sound of the spoon against metal made the children think she was still finding more. A father might tear his own bread smaller before anyone noticed, then place part of it near the child who had been quiet all morning. The child might accept it without understanding what had been given up. Illness entered these rooms without needing permission. A cough could pass from one crowded bed to another, and there was often too little medicine to make anyone feel secure. A feverish child might lie under a coat instead of a proper blanket, while adults lowered their voices so fear would not fill the room before nightfall. The lack of food made every sickness seem heavier. The cold also changed the way people used their bodies. They sat closer together, kept coats on indoors, and warmed their hands around bowls even when the soup gave little strength. A grandmother might keep a child near her knees, rubbing small fingers between her palms while pretending the gesture was only affection. In truth, everyone was saving warmth wherever it could be found. A meal no longer ended with fullness. It ended when the bowls were empty, when the bread was gone, and when everyone understood not to ask for more. Someone might turn away from the table too quickly, so others would not see the hunger still on his face. Someone else might fold a cloth over crumbs too small to matter, because even crumbs had become worth saving. The worst part was how ordinary it became. Day after day, families learned to live with less, then less again, until hunger was part of the room like a chair or a cracked wall. Children grew used to watching adult hands before eating. Adults grew used to hiding their own portions from themselves. By then, food was no longer only food. It was love divided into pieces too small to protect anyone, dignity held in a bowl of thin soup, and fear measured by how long one loaf could last. The Minsk Ghetto did not need to be silent for suffering to exist there. It only needed a table, a pot, and a mother, trying to make almost nothing look like enough. Hunger in the Minsk Ghetto turned each meal into a painful decision, where every piece of bread carried the weight of someone else going without. from those small kitchens and weak bodies. The story moves to the gates where people were called out for forced labour and families waited to see who would return. Before long, a Wakot God could wait a man for one morning, while another person without the right paper stood still, already understanding what that missing document might cost. At the gates of the Minsk Ghetto, morning did not feel like the beginning of a day. It felt like a test. People gathered with thin coats, buttons, hands holding work cards, identity papers, or small bundles of food that would not be enough for the hours ahead. Behind them, in rooms and courtyards still crowded from the night, families waited without knowing whether the people leaving would come back. A man might stand near the line with a work card folded inside his palm. The paper was small, but it carried more weight than anything else he owned. His wife stood a few steps behind him with a cloth bag pressed against her coat, watching the guard's hands rather than the guard's face. She knew that one glance at the Rongropa could chichi the whole morning. The checking was slow enough to make fear grow. A German guard or an official at the gate could take a card, look at the name, look at the face, and send one person to one side while another remained standing in place. Those with papers that seemed useful were allowed through for labour. Those without the right mark could feel the air around them change before anyone said what would happen. Forced labour gave some people a thin kind of hope. A person who could work might be kept alive because the system needed hands, bodies, and strength for tasks outside or inside the ghetto. Men and women were sent to repair, carry, clean, build, sort, or perform whatever labour the occupiers demanded. Work could keep someone moving for another day, but it was not a rescue. The labour card could protect a person only in the narrowest way. It might help him pass the gate in the morning, but it could not protect his family left behind in a crowded room. It could not stop a new order from changing the meaning of the card. It could not turn a system built for destruction into a system of safety. A father might return at dusk with shoulders bent from the day's work. Dust clung to his sleeves, his hands shook slightly, and the bread he brought back was so small that he placed it on the table without looking at the children first. He might tell himself that surviving the day mattered. Still, he knew the paper in his pocket had only bought hours, not security, inside the ghetto. People understood this uneven protection. A worker might be envied because he had a card, but he was also pitied because his usefulness could vanish at any moment. A woman might look at her husband's paper and feel relief, then shame for feeling relief when another neighbour had no such document. Every family measured luck against someone else's fear. The humiliation was quiet and constant. Adults who had once earned a living with skill and pride now stood in line to be counted by people who treated them as tools. A tailor, a clerk, a teacher, or a carpenter could be reduced to a body fit or unfit for work. A person's value was no longer measured by character, family, memory, or name. It was measured by usefulness. Work also weakened the body that was supposed to prove its strength. People left hungry, worked under guard, and returned to rooms where food was scarce, and rest was broken by noise, crowding, and fear. A man might sit on the edge of a shared bed and rub dirt from his wrists while a child watched him carefully. Even his silence taught the room something. There were moments when labour seemed to create order. People knew where to stand, what paper to carry, when to leave, and when to return. That small pattern could feel better than pure waiting, because routine gave the mind something to hold. But the routine belonged to the oppressor, and every part of it could be taken away without warning. A woman standing near the gate might count the people sent through, and the people held back. She might not know all their names, but she could read their faces. One man looked angry, another looked blank, and another kept touching his coat pocket as if a missing paper might appear there if he checked again. The line did not need shouting to feel cruel. By then, forced labour had become another layer of the ghetto's trap. It kept some people alive long enough to be used, while leaving them surrounded by the knowledge that usefulness was temporary. It divided families each morning, returned them changed each evening, and made a thin piece of paper seem like the difference between life and disappearance. Nobody could build a future on that. The workers who passed the gate carried more than tools or orders. They carried the eyes of those who stayed behind, the fear of those without cards, and the knowledge that a day of survival could still end in loss. In the Minsk Ghetto, labour did not mean freedom. It meant being needed by a system that still intended to erase you. Forced labour gave some people in the Minsk Ghetto a fragile chance to survive one more day. But every work card depended on the same authority that wanted the community destroyed. As those cards became weaker against new orders, fear began to gather around another word that could empty rooms and courtyards without warning. In time, even a rumour of an action would make families shut windows, pull children from hallways, and listen for boots coming toward the door. A rumour of an action could move through the Minsk Ghetto faster than any official order. It might begin with one person crossing a courtyard too quickly, his coat half-buttoned, his face tight, his eyes avoiding anyone who tried to stop him. A woman at an upper window might see him and pull the curtain aside just enough to watch where he went. By the time he reached the next doorway, several families had already heard enough to be afraid. No one needed the whole story. A few words were enough, because everyone knew what they might mean. A search, a roundup, a list. A line of people taken from rooms and streets before anyone could learn who had been chosen. Doors closed more softly than usual. Mothers pulled children away from stairwells, not roughly enough to make them cry, but firmly enough that the children understood not to ask questions. A man pushed a small bundle under a bed, then took it out again, because he was not sure whether hiding it made sense. Another family moved papers from a table into a crack behind a loose board. The courtyard changed within minutes. A place that had been crowded with people waiting for water or speaking in low voices became a place of turned heads, half-closed windows, and bodies standing close to walls. A child who had been sitting on a step was brought inside and placed near the stove, where his mother pressed a hand over his mouth before he even made a sound. She was not angry with him. She was afraid of his breathing becoming too loud. Minsk Ghetto went through many searches, killings, and roundups during its existence. People were gathered, separated from their homes, and sent toward execution sites or other places of death. For the families inside, these events were not only historical stages with names and dates. They were mornings when a sound in the street could decide whether someone stayed in a room or vanished from it. The hardest part was not knowing. A person could be hungry, cold, and still try to endure the day if he understood its limits. But an action made every limit disappear. A worker's card, an old person's weakness, a child's small body, a mother's pleading face, a father's careful documents. None of these could guarantee anything once the search began. In one room, a family might stand out. The father listened near the door, not touching the handle, because even the smallest movement might sound too loud. The mother gathered the children close to the corner where coats hung from nails, while an old woman sat on the bed with her hands folded in her lap. Someone had told them soldiers were coming from the far street. Nobody knew if that was true. That uncertainty made people do things, they would later barely remember. A cup might be left in the middle of the table, bread might remain uncovered, a child's shoe might be lost under a blanket, because there was no time to search for it calmly. The ordinary details of the room became scattered by fear before the soldiers even arrived. In another building, a young man might climb toward an attic space that was too small to hold him comfortably. Dust clung to his sleeves, and the wood scraped his knuckles as he tried to pull himself into the dark. Below him, his sister moved a chair back into place, so the room looked untouched. She did it, with hands that shook so badly, the chair legs tapped once against the floor. Every sound mattered. Boots on the street could belong to a patrol or only to workers returning late. A shout near the gate could mean that a search had begun or only that someone was being stopped. A wagon wheel, a door hit too hard, a dog barking beyond the wall, all of it could make people freeze in place. The ghetto taught families to fear signs before facts. They learned to watch faces, listen to footsteps, and read the speed of another person's walk. A neighbour moving too fast could be enough to make people hide documents, pull children indoors, or stop cooking in the middle of a meal. The body reacted before the mind had proof. That kind of fear was exhausting. It did not need to strike every day to rule every day. Even when no action came, the rumour left rooms colder and people more careful. It reminded everyone that the ghetto was not only crowded and hungry, but also waiting for violence that could enter without warning. By the time a real action began, the street no longer felt like a place where people lived. It became a space where families could be pulled out, counted, separated, and pushed into lines. A doorway no longer promised shelter. A courtyard no longer meant neighbours. Everything could become part of the process. For those inside the Minsk ghetto, the terror of an action was that it turned uncertainty into movement. One moment, a family was standing in a room, listening. The next, someone was in the stairwell, someone was being ordered outside, and someone was trying to keep hold of a child's hand. A whole life could be forced into the street in minutes. The rumour of an action turned the Minsk ghetto into a place where even silence felt dangerous, because no family knew whether its own door would be opened next. When the search became real, the fear inside rooms spilled into the streets, and people were no longer simply waiting behind walls. A father would hold one child's hand, a mother would clutch a small bag, and the crowd would move faster than the weakest person could walk. When an action reached the street, the fear that had lived behind doors became visible. People were pushed out of rooms where blankets still lay on the floor, bowls still sat on tables, and coats still hung from nails. A father might step into the stairwell with one child's hand held tightly in his own, while his wife followed with a small cloth bag pressed against her side. Behind them, an old woman moved more slowly than the line allowed. The stairs were not built for panic. They were narrow, worn, and crowded with people trying to carry children, papers, bread, coats, and whatever small objects still seemed worth saving. Someone's shoulder struck the wall, someone's bundle slipped, and someone bent down for a dropped shoe before being pulled forward again. There was no time for careful movement. Outside, the street no longer looked like a street where people lived. It became a place of sorting, pushing, counting, and shouting, where families tried to remain families, while the force around them treated them as a mass. A child might cling to his mother's coat, fingers twisted into the cloth so tightly that his knuckles whitened. The mother held the bag in one hand and reached back for him with the other. The father kept looking behind him. He was trying to see whether his wife was still there, whether the old woman had reached the curb, and whether the child beside him still had both shoes. His work card, once folded carefully in his pocket, now felt useless against the movement of the crowd. A document could not hold a family together when bodies were being forced down the street. During the killings connected with Minsk, Jewish people were gathered, removed from homes, and taken to execution sites or killing centres. To later records, these events could become numbers, dates, and places. To the people in the street, they were hands slipping, doors left open, children crying into coats, and neighbours seeing one another without being able to help. History was happening at walking speed. The old and the weak suffered first in the movement. A grandmother with a cane could not match the pace of frightened adults pushed from behind. A sick man leaned on someone's shoulder until the pressure of the crowd separated them. A small child stumbled because the street was uneven and because no one had enough space to bend safely. Families tried to slow down without appearing to resist. A son might move beside his mother to block her from being shoved too hard. A daughter might take the old woman's elbow and whisper nothing at all, because comfort would have made the fear more real. The crowd pressed forward, and every family had to choose between staying together and not falling behind. The cruelty of such moments was not only in where people were being sent. It was in how quickly the ordinary bonds of life were attacked. A father who had spent years feeding, teaching, and protecting his children now found that his strength meant little in a street controlled by armed men. A mother who had measured bread carefully the night before now measured the distance between bodies. One hand became everything. There were faces at windows, but windows could not protect anyone. Some people looked out for a second, some said not for a second, then pulled back as if being seen might bring danger to their own door. Others stayed frozen behind dark glass, watching neighbours move past with bags, coats, children, and old parents. The ghetto had already taught them that witness did not always mean power. In the street, people carried the last signs of private life. A woman held a cup wrapped in cloth, though she could not have explained why she had taken it. A man kept touching his coat pocket to check for papers that no longer mattered. A little girl held a piece of bread in one hand and her mother's sleeve in the other, and she seemed more afraid of dropping the sleeve than the bread. That detail says enough. The line moved faster than grief could understand. A doorway disappeared behind one family, then another, then another. Someone turned back once, not to escape, but to see the window of the room where the mourning had begun. The window was already part of a life that could not be returned to. When people were forced into the streets during an action, they did not stop being individuals because a system treated them as a crowd. Each person carried a room, a table, a bed, a name, and someone who might still be searching for their hand. A community was not erased only by killing. It was also torn apart in these minutes, when the living bonds between people were broken in public. The father still tried to count his family. His wife was behind him, the child beside him, the old woman somewhere close enough to hear, but not close enough to hold. The street had become too loud, too crowded, and too controlled for him to know whether one more step would keep them together, or separate them forever. This was how a city street became a place of loss. The action turned the street into a place where families were pushed forward faster than the old, the sick, and the children could safely move. From those busy roads, many people were taken away from Minsk toward places whose names would later carry the weight of mass death. At Maly Trostenets, the city would end not in resettlement or labour, but in a killing site organised with roads, guards, vehicles, and prepared ground. The road out of Minsk did not need to look unusual to become frightening. It could begin with the same rough surface, the same edge of broken pavement, and the same low buildings fading behind the vehicle. People inside a covered truck might not see the full road, only pieces of it through a gap in the cloth. A strip of grey sky, a line of trees, the side of another vehicle, and the face of someone sitting too close to breathe easily. The city moved away from them without saying goodbye. A man near the side of the truck might try to keep one hand on his child's coat. His fingers could slip against the cloth each time the vehicle struck a rut in the road, and he might tighten his grip without looking down, afraid that any small movement would show too much fear. Across from him, a woman held a bundle in her lap, although by then the bundle had almost no practical use. It was only proof that she had left home as a person who still owned something. The road became worse beyond the familiar streets. Wheels hit holes, shoulders struck shoulders, and people tried not to fall against strangers already pressed against them. Someone's knee touched a wooden sideboard. Someone else lowered his head because the air under the cover had become warm, damp, and thin. Through a narrow tear in the fabric, a boy could see trees gathering closer. The destination was not exhausted in a way that gave comfort. In Nazi language, removal often came wrapped in official words, but the people being moved could feel the difference between travel and being taken. There were guards, vehicles, lists, orders, and a direction that did not depend on anyone inside the truck. The passengers did not need to know the name Maly Trostenets to understand that the city behind them was no longer reachable. Maly Trostenets, near Minsk, became one of the major Nazi killing sites in occupied Belarus. It was connected not only to the destruction of Jews from the Minsk Ghetto, but also to the murder of Jews deported from other parts of Europe. People were brought there through a system that used transport, guards, paperwork, forced movement, and prepared places outside ordinary public view. Death was made into a procedure. That is what makes the place so cold in memory. It was not only a clearing, a road, or a place beyond the city. It was a site where the process had been arranged in advance, where the distance from Minsk separate victims from the streets, rooms, and neighbours that had formed their lives. A person could be removed from a doorway in the ghetto and carried step by step into a system already waiting beyond the trees. People remained calm. A mother still noticed whether her child's collar was twisted. An old man still shifted his foot because it had gone numb. A woman still kept her thumb pressed against the edge of a folded paper hidden in her sleeve, though she may have known it could not help her anymore. The system treated them as a transport, but each body held a life. The road stripped away ordinary choices. No one could decide where to sit, when to stop, whether to open the air cover, or whether to return for someone left behind. A guard's voice outside mattered more than any family's need inside. Even fear had to be kept small, because there was no space for it to move. For those taken from Minsk, the journey out of the city carried another cruelty. The buildings they knew had already become unreachable, but they still existed somewhere behind them. A room might still contain a coat on a nail, a bowl on a table, a blanket folded near a wall, or a child's shoe left under a bed. The life they had been forced to leave did not vanish at the same speed as the vehicle. The trees ahead made the world feel less public. In the ghetto, suffering had happened in rooms, streets, staircases, and courtyards where neighbours could at least see pieces of one another's fear. Outside the city, the road led toward places where fewer witnesses could watch and fewer names could be spoken aloud. The farther the vehicle moved, the more the victims were carried away from the ordinary evidence that they had belonged somewhere. Maly Trostenets became part of a wider machinery of murder. The horror was not only that people were killed there, but that their deaths were connected to schedules, transports, guards, and repeated procedures. A killing site did not have to look large from a distance to hold a vast crime. It only needed a road, an order, and people forced to arrive. By the time the truck left the clearer edge of the city, some people may have stopped looking through the gaps. Looking did not change the road. The father kept his hand near the child's coat, the woman kept the useless bundle in her lap, and the old man braced himself against the wooden side. Around them, no one had enough room to stand fully upright, but everyone understood they were being carried farther from the world that still knew their names. Maly Trostenets showed how the destruction of Minsk's Jewish community was tied to roads, vehicles, guards' lists, and killing grounds beyond the city. Yet even while people were being carried away, others inside the ghetto tried to resist erasure through hidden messages, secret contacts, and dangerous attempts to move people out. Inside dark rooms, a folded scrap of paper could pass from one hand to another, while a guard stood close enough to hear a floorboard shift. Inside the Minsk ghetto, resistance did not always look like a weapon held in the open. Sometimes it looked like a folded scrap of paper pressed into a palm, a glance toward a doorway, or a young person crossing a courtyard by a different route than usual. The people who carried messages did not look heroic from a distance. They looked tired, hungry, and careful, because looking ordinary was often part of staying alive. A small note might pass through 3 hands before reaching the person meant to read it. One hand took it from under a sleeve, another hid it near a belt, and another slipped it beneath a loose board in a room where children were pretending not to watch. The words on it could be short because long messages were dangerous. A name, a time, a street, a warning, or the possibility of escape could matter more than a full explanation. The Minsk ghetto had an underground network that helped with contact, hiding, escape, and connections to partisan groups outside the city. This mattered because it reminded us that the people trapped there were not simply waiting to disappear. They were watched, weakened, and threatened, but some still found ways to act inside the narrow spaces left to them. Survival itself could become a form of resistance. A woman might stand near a stove while hiding a paper beneath her clothing. Her face would need to look normal, even if her heart beat hard enough for her to feel it in her throat. A guard might be close outside, or a neighbour might enter at the wrong moment, or a child might ask too loudly what she was carrying. She had to make fear look like daily life. That was the danger of small actions. In another room, a young man waited near the door with his coat already buttoned. He was not leaving for work in the usual sense, though he might carry himself that way if someone saw him. Under the cloth near his wrist, there might be a note meant for another building, or news about a patrol, or the name of someone who needed to be moved before morning. One wrong step could destroy more than one life. The underground depended on trust, and trust was difficult in a place built to break people. A family might have to decide whether to hide someone behind a wall, under bedding, or in storage corner too small for comfort. The person hidden could not cough, speak, or shift too much when boots passed in the hallway. The family hiding him had to continue looking poor, tired, and ordinary. Nothing about this courage was clean or simple. People were hungry, frightened, and surrounded by others who were also trying to survive. A mother hiding a stranger might still have children of her own to feed. A man carrying a message might know that if he were caught, the danger could spread to the room where his family slept. The choice was never easy. Yet the underground existed because some people understood that Nazi Germany wanted more than obedience. It wanted people isolated, helpless, unnamed, and easier to destroy. A hidden message pushed back against that isolation. A warning passed before a search could keep a person alive for another night. A route toward the forest could turn a sealed ghetto into something with one narrow crack. Inside dark rooms, people spoke carefully. They might lean close over a table where a bowl still held a little water, lowering their voices while footsteps moved somewhere below. A hand could point to a street corner on a torn piece of paper, then fold the paper quickly when someone passed the door. The whole conversation might last less than a minute. The children noticed more than adults wished. They saw which visitors came after dark, which bundles were kept away from the usual bedding, and which adults stopped talking when a stranger stepped into the room. Some children were hidden, moved, or kept quiet by people risking their own lives. A child might not understand the network, but he understood the hand placed gently over his mouth when danger came near. The ghetto taught people to think in small distances. One staircase, one courtyard, one gate, one path between buildings where a guard's view was weaker for a moment. The underground had to work inside those distances, using memory, timing, and the courage of people who had little strength left. It was not enough to save everyone. It could not stop the larger machinery of the Holocaust, and it could not undo the deportations, killings, hunger, and fear that surrounded Minsk. But it kept some names moving, some warnings alive, and some people connected to the world beyond the walls. In a place designed to erase a community, even a hidden route carried meaning. A person leaving a room with a message did not know if he would return. He might pass a guard at the corner, keep his eyes lowered, and feel the paper close against his skin. Behind him, someone would wait without moving the chair, without touching the door, without letting the children ask where he had gone. Hope had to stay quiet to survive. The underground inside the Minsk ghetto showed that resistance could mean hiding a person, carrying a message, or keeping one more life beyond the reach of a search. From those dark rooms and secret huts, the story moves toward the forest paths where escape looked like freedom but carried its own dangers. A person who slipped out of the ghetto still had to face patrols, informers, hunger, dogs, and the terrifying question of which door in the dark might betray him. Leaving the Minsk ghetto did not mean stepping straight into safety. For those who tried to escape, the first minutes outside the guarded space could feel less like freedom than exposure. A small group might move after dark, wearing dark coats, carrying almost nothing, and avoiding the roads where patrols were more likely to pass. Behind them was the ghetto, but around them was still occupied land. They could not walk like travellers. They moved in broken pauses, stopping under trees, beside walls, or near ditches when a sound came from the distance. A dog barking somewhere beyond the road could freeze the whole group in place. No one wanted to be the person whose breath, shoe, or snapped branch gave the others away. The road to the Fost was full of choices that could not be tested safely. A main road was faster, but it could bring them close to German patrols or local collaborators. A side path was quieter, but it could lead to a farm where someone might report them. A door with light behind it could mean help, or it could mean betrayal. That uncertainty followed every step. Some Jews from the Minsk ghetto did escape and make contact with partisan groups outside the city. But escape was never simple, because the land beyond the ghetto was also controlled, watched, and dangerous. German forces, collaborators, hunger, weather, unfamiliar paths, and the constant risk of being denounced or all stood between escape and survival. Getting out was only the first test. A young man might lead the group because he knew part of the route from before the war, but even his memory was no longer reliable because checkpoints could appear, roads could be blocked, and people who once seemed harmless might now be afraid enough to betray others. He might remember a barn, a stream, or a line of trees, but memory could not tell him who had changed sides. The old map of trust was gone. A woman walking behind him might carry bread wrapped in cloth under her coat. The bread was not enough for a journey, but leaving without it would feel impossible. Her feet slipped in mud, or in colder weather pressed into thin crusts of snow that made every step louder than she wanted. She kept one hand on the shoulder of the child in front of her, not to guide him, but to feel that he was still there. The child might not understand where they were going. He only knew that he was not allowed to speak, not allowed to cry, and not allowed to ask whether they would sleep in a bed again. His shoes might be too thin for the ground, and each time the group stopped, he looked up at the adults to see if the danger had passed. The adults rarely looked certain. Hunger became different outside the ghetto. Inside, hunger belonged to rooms, bowls, and thin soup. Outside, it belonged to walking with an empty stomach, knowing that food could not be cooked without smoke, bought without papers, or asked for without risk. A crust saved in a pocket might have to be divided under trees with fingers too cold to move easily. The forest could seem close and remain unreachable. A dark line of trees might appear ahead, but between the group and that cover, there could be a road, a field, a fence, or a house with someone awake inside. The forest promised hiding, but it also promised cold, wet ground, confusion, and the chance of becoming lost. It was not a gentle place. For people trying to reach partisans, every person met along the way became a question. A farmer might look away and let them pass. Another might point in the wrong direction. A third might pretend not to understand and then send word to those who hunted escapees. Trust had to be measured in seconds. The fear of dogs was especially sharp. A bark could come from a village yard, a patrol, or a farm they had passed too closely. People knew that dogs could carry danger faster than human feet. A mother might pull a child down into the wet grass and press his face against her coat, hoping he would breathe quietly until the sound faded. There were no clean, heroic moments in this kind of escape. There were only tired legs, wet hems, shaking hands, and whispers so low they barely counted as speech. Someone might want to turn back, but turning back meant returning to the ghetto and the next action. Someone else want to keep walking, but walking too long in the wrong direction could kill them slowly. The hope was real, but no one dared to hold it openly. If they found the partisan contacts, they might live outside the ghetto's walls and become part of a wider resistance. If they failed, they could be captured, shot, reported, or sent back into the machinery they had tried to escape. Each step carried both possibilities. Behind them, most of the community remained trapped in Minsk. Rooms were still crowded, kitchens still thin, and families still listened for the sounds of searches and orders. The escape of a few did not make the ghetto less dangerous for those left inside. It only proved that the desire to live had found one narrow path through the dark. The road from the Minsk ghetto to the forest was not a clean passage into freedom, but a dangerous path through patrols, informers, hunger, dogs, and fear. While a few people tried to reach the partisans beyond the city, most families remained inside the ghetto as each killing action made their world smaller. After every massacre, a room could still have a coat on the wall, a bowl on the table, and a bed that no one would ever return to. After each massacre, The Minsk Ghetto did not become quiet in the way a resting place becomes quiet. It became quiet because fewer people were left to move through the rooms, climb the stairs, call across the courtyard, or stand in line for water. A room that had been crowded the night before might now have one bed with no one lying on it, one bowl still waiting on the table, and one coat hanging from a nail, as if its owner had only stepped outside. The people who returned did not always know whether to touch those things or leave them exactly where they were. A woman might stand in the doorway and recognize every object too clearly. The blanket still held the flattened shape of a body, and the cup near the table edge still sat where someone had left it before being forced outside. She might reach toward the coat, then stop with her fingers still in the air, because taking it down would feel like saying the person was gone, leaving it there hurt in another way. The destruction of the Minsk Ghetto came through repeated waves of violence, deportation, killing, and finally liquidation. It was not only one single day that emptied the community, it was a process that returned again and again, removing people from rooms, workshops, streets, and courtyards until the familiar world became thinner after every action. The ghetto survived by losing more of itself. For the people still alive, returning could feel almost unbearable. A man might come back to a shared room and see that his neighbour's place was empty, while his own bundle remained under the table. He might sit on the edge of the bed without taking off his coat, because undressing would make the evening feel too normal. Across the room, someone might wash a bowl that no one would use again, simply because her hands needed something to do. The stairwell carried its own record of absence. One child no longer ran ahead on the steps. One old man no longer coughed near the landing. One woman no longer knocked softly on a neighbour's door to borrow a little hot water. The building had fewer bodies inside it, but the fear did not become smaller. People tried to keep order because the alternative was too frightening. A mother might fold a blanket at the foot of an empty bed, not because she believed the owner would return, but because leaving it twisted on the floor felt cruel. Someone else might move a pair of shoes closer to the wall, then regret moving them at all. In the Minsk Ghetto, even small acts of cleaning could feel like disturbing evidence. If this kind of slow, grounded history helps you stay with the human details behind these events, you may like the video and subscribe before we continue. It helps more viewers find stories told carefully, without turning suffering into noise. Now we return to the rooms where absence had become part of daily life. The ghetto taught people to read what was missing. A closed door could mean a family was hiding, or it could mean no one remained behind it. A dark window could mean fuel was being saved, or it could mean the room had been emptied. A courtyard without a familiar figure at the wall could change the whole feeling of the morning. After each wave of killing, the objects left behind seemed too ordinary for what had happened. A spoon still lay beside a bowl. The thread still hung from a sleeve. A child's small shoe might remain under a bed, half hidden by dust and cloth. Nothing in the room indicated that the person who owned it would not come back. That was one of the quieter forms of cruelty. Nazi Germany not only murdered people and removed bodies from the ghetto, it also left survivors among rooms, filled with proof that the missing had lived there only hours or days before. A coat, a cup, a blanket, and a bed became witnesses that could not speak. Some survivors avoided touching those things as long as they could. Others had no choice, because space was too crowded, the cold was too sharp, and hunger did not allow objects to remain untouched forever. A coat might have to be worn by someone else, a blanket might have to cover another child, and a bowl might be used again at the next thin meal. in rooms with too little food and too little space. Grief had to make room for the living. Children noticed these changes in a different way. They might not understand the full meaning of massacre, deportation, or liquidation, but they understood that someone who had been there yesterday was no longer at the table. They saw adults lower their voices near empty beds. They learned that asking where a person had gone could make a room go still. The fear after each massacre changed shape. Before, people feared being taken. Afterward, they feared being taken and also feared being left behind to wait for the next time. Each surviving family understood that an emptier ghetto was not a safer ghetto, only one with fewer witnesses left inside it. The people who remained lived among spaces that kept shrinking around them. Fewer voices rose from the courtyard, fewer hands reached for water, fewer children pressed against the stairwell walls when adults passed. Yet every empty place made the danger feel more personal, because the missing were not strangers from a number. They were the people whose bowls, coats, and blankets still sat nearby. The ghetto was being erased room by room. Each massacre took more names, more faces, more habits, more small kindnesses, and more proof that a community had once filled those streets with ordinary life. What remained was not calm. It was the heavy silence of places that had lost the people who gave them meaning. After each massacre, the Minsk ghetto did not become safer, only emptier, with beds, bowls, coats and doorways left behind by people who would not return. The next wound falls most heavily on the children, who learned fear before they had enough years to understand the world that had trapped them. A child would sit near a dark window, with a piece of bread in his hand, already knowing how to stay silent when footsteps came down the hallway. A child in the Minsk ghetto learned fear through the habits of adults, before he understood the reasons behind it. He learned that footsteps in the hallway could make a room change at once, that a mother's hand on his shoulder meant silence, and that a closed door did not always mean safety. He learned to look at faces before asking for food, water, or permission to move closer to the window. Childhood became a lesson in watch. A boy might sit near a dark window wearing a coat too large for his body. The sleeves covered part of his hands, and inside one fist, he held a small piece of bread he had not eaten yet. He was hungry, but he had learned to wait because adults sometimes saved food for later without explaining when later would come. His mother stood near the doorway, listening to the stairwell. The room around him was not built for childhood. There were blankets on the floor, bundles under the table, coats hanging from nails, and bowls stacked near a stove that too many people needed to use. He could not run across the room without stepping over someone's things. Even play had to become small, quiet, and careful. Jewish children in ghettos were among the most vulnerable victims of the Holocaust. Hunger weakened them quickly, sickness spread easily in crowded rooms, and deportations or killing actions placed them in constant danger. In Minsk, as in other ghettos, children were not protected by their innocence. The system treated them as part of the community it intended to destroy. A child learned the rules of danger through repetition. Do not cry when someone hides you. Do not ask loudly where a missing neighbor went. Do not stand too close to the window when soldiers are near. Do not run into the courtyard just because the air outside looked open. These were not lessons any child should have needed. In one corner, a girl might sit beside her grandmother while adults whispered near the table. She would pretend to look at the floor, but her eyes followed every movement. A folded paper passed from one hand to another. A man near the door shifted his weight, and her mother's mouth tightened when boots sounded below. The girl did not know every word, but she understood the room had become more dangerous. Children also learned hunger differently from adults. An adult could understand shortage, rationing, and the slow exhaustion of the body. A child understood the size of his portion, the length of time until the next meal, and the way his mother sometimes placed food in front of him, while keeping none for herself. He might notice her hands more than her words. Illness made childhood even smaller. A feverish child could lie under a coat because there was not enough bedding, while adults touched his forehead and tried not to show fear. Medicine was scarce, rooms were crowded, and weakness made every cough sound more serious. A mother might sit beside him through the night, listening not only to his breathing but also to the hallway beyond the door. Outside, the courtyard no longer belonged to children. It was a place of lines, rumours, guards, and adults waiting with lowered voices. A child who once might have played there now stayed close to a wall, watching boots, bags, papers and faces. If another child disappeared after an action, no one explained it in a way that made sense. The absence taught enough. Some children were hidden during searches. A mother might push a child behind bedding, under a table, or into a narrow space where he had to hold still until his legs hurt. She might press a finger to her lips, then place her hand over his mouth when footsteps came closer. The child would feel her palm shaking and understand that silence was not a game. The cruelty of this was not only that children suffered. It was that they were forced to become careful before they had the chance to become fully curious. They learned to measure adult fear, to save crumbs, to sit still, to avoid attention, and to carry questions inside themselves. A community loses part of its future when its children begin learning survival instead of ordinary life. In a room after another round of violence, a child might look at an empty place on the floor where another child had slept. The blanket could still be there, folded badly, with one sleeve of a small coat lying across it. He might want to ask whether the other child would read, but the faces around him would make the questions stay in his throat. Silence became a way of understanding. Adults tried to protect children with whatever small means remained. They gave them the warmer corner, the softer piece of bread, the better part of a blanket, or the lie that a missing person might come later. These gestures did not stop the danger, but they showed that family life had not completely surrendered. Even in the ghetto, care survived in pieces. Yet the larger reality was harsher than any comfort could cover. The Minsk Ghetto was not only taking adults from work, homes and streets. It was taking children from the idea of a future, turning them into witnesses of hunger, fear, disappearance and waiting. The destruction of a community became most visible in the faces of children who had learned too early not to make noise. A child near the window might finally eat the bread in his hand slowly, as if making it last could make the day last too. His mother might turn from the hallway and see him chewing without expression, not because he was calm, but because he had already learned that showing need made adults suffer more. In that small room, childhood had been pushed into silence before it had time to grow. The children of the Minsk Ghetto learned hunger, silence, hiding, and fear before they had enough years to understand why the world around them had changed. From those small faces and quiet rooms, the story moves to the adults whose former work, skills, and roles were also stripped down by the same system. A teacher with hidden pages, a doctor with an old medicine bag, and a tailor bent over worn cloth would soon be reduced on paper to labour, numbers, or names waiting to disappear. In the Minsk Ghetto, the people crowded into rooms were not only victims waiting in line, they had been teachers, doctors, tailors, carpenters, shopkeepers, clerks, mothers, fathers, neighbours, and people known by the work of their hands. A man who now stands with a labour paper might once have repaired a table so carefully that families kept it for years. A woman sitting beside a weak lamp might have once taught children how to read their first letters. A doctor could still keep an old medicine bag under a bed or beside a wall. The leather might be cracked, the metal clasp dull, and the inside almost empty of the supplies that once gave it meaning. Still, people looked at that bag with a small kind of hope when a child developed a fever or an old person began coughing through the night. The doctor had almost nothing left, but the room still treated his hands as if they remembered how to help. A teacher might hide a few pages from a book between folded clothes. There was little time for lessons, and children had already learned far more about silence, hunger, and danger than any child should know. Yet a page with letters on it still mattered because it reminded people that children were meant to be taught, not trained only to hide. The paper itself became a small piece of the life taken from them. A tailor might sit near a table with worn cloth spread across his knees. He could mend a sleeve, patch a torn coat, or make a child's garment last longer than it should have lasted. His needle moved slowly because his hands were tired and the light was weak, but people still brought him fabric when they could. Clothing was warmth, dignity, and survival all at once. These skills once helped hold a community together. A doctor eased pain, a teacher shaped young minds, a tailor kept bodies covered, and a carpenter made broken rooms usable again. In normal life, these roles give people identity and respect. Inside the ghetto, Nazi control reduced them to usefulness, paperwork, labour categories and lists. That was part of the erasure. It not only takes people from their homes and streets, it took away the meanings that had surrounded their lives. A person who had spent years caring for patients could be written down only as a worker. A person who had taught children could be treated as a number to be moved, used, or removed. German documents and ghetto administration could flatten a whole life into a few lines. A name, an age, a trade, a work status, a mark of fitness or uselessness. These could decide how a person was handled. The paper did not show the doctor's sleepless nights, the teacher's patient voice, the tailor's careful fingers, or the carpenter's pride in a repaired chair. It made human beings easier to process. In one crowded room, several of these former lives might sit together under one weak light. The doctor checked a child's forehead with hands that had no medicine to offer. The teacher folded a page back into a hiding place when footsteps passed outside. The tailor bent over a coat while a woman waited silently beside him, holding the torn sleeve between two fingers. Their work continued, but the world that had honoured it was being destroyed around them. There was quiet dignity in these small acts. A repaired coat meant someone might be less cold. A hidden page meant a child might still remember letters. A careful touch from a doctor meant a sick person was still being treated as a person, not only as a burden. The ghetto tried to strip life down to hunger and fear, but people kept small roles alive where they could. Still, no skill could promise safety. A work card might protect a tailor for a morning. A doctor might be needed until he is not. A carpenter might be kept for labour, then lose that fragile protection when orders changed. The same system that used their abilities could also decide they no longer mattered. This made every sign of usefulness painful. A person wanted it to be needed, because being needed could mean surviving one more day. But being needed by a violent system was not the same as being saved. It meant living under a rule where your hands' strength of knowledge could be valued while your life was still considered disposable. The community was being taken apart in layers. First came the loss of rights, then homes, then space, then food, then people, and then even the names of what those people had once been. A teacher became labour, a doctor became labour, a tailor became labour. Later, many became names on lists of the missing and dead. In a small room, the old medicine bag, the hidden pages, the needle and the worn tools still carried memory. They showed that the people of Minsk had not been an empty crowd. They had built families, helped neighbours, taught children, mended clothes, treated illness, and filled the city with ordinary work. Nazi Germany tried to erase not only their bodies, but the whole pattern of how they had lived. The Minsk Ghetto not only took lives, but it stripped teachers, doctors, tailors, and workers of the roles that had once held their community together. As those roles were broken down into papers, labour lists and danger, the people still alive had to decide what pieces of memory could be hidden and carried forward. Behind a thin wall, one survivor might clutch a family photograph in a sweating hand while listening as the life he knew was dragged away outside the door. Behind a wooden wall in the Minsk Ghetto, a person could learn how heavy silence felt inside the body. He might lie in a narrow space between boards, with dust near his mouth, one shoulder pressed against rough wood, and his knees pulled close because there was no room to stretch. Through a thin crack, he could see only a line of weak light and the lower part of a room he once crossed without thinking. His hand held a small family photograph so tightly that the paper had softened with sweat. The footsteps outside did not need to be loud. A boot on a stair, a chair moved across the floor, or a voice near the doorway could make his breath stop in his chest. He could hear people entering the room, opening drawers, touching bedding, and dragging objects across the floor. The room still belonged to his memory, but he could no longer move inside it as a living man. He had become someone hidden inside his own life. Some people survived the Minsk Ghetto through hiding, underground help, escape to partisan groups, or a narrow chain of luck that could break at any moment. Most did not. After the final destruction of the ghetto, only a small number remained compared with the community that had once filled the streets, workshops, kitchens, schools, and courtyards. Survival was not a clean victory. It was often a condition of being still, quiet, and almost erased before death could reach you. A person in hiding had to protect more than his body. He also protected the last pieces of memory that proved a normal life had existed before the ghetto. A photograph, a name written on folded paper, a child's ribbon, a letter, or a small religious object could matter more than its size. These things could not feed anyone or stop a guard, but they held a person against disappearance. The photograph in his hand might show people standing in better clothes beside a table, or a child sitting on a chair, or a mother whose face had already begun to blur at the edges. He might not dare look at it often, because even turning the paper could make a sound. Still, his thumb stayed against it as if touch alone could keep the faces from vanishing. Memory had to be held carefully. Outside the hiding space, the room continued to be searched or emptied. A coat might be taken from a nail. A blanket might be pulled from a bed. A cupboard might be opened, and the small disorder left behind could tell him that people had touched everything except the place where he lay. He could hear his old life being handled by strangers. That was a different kind of fear. It was not only the fear of being found, it was the fear of listening while the world that knew you was taken apart piece by piece. If he survived the search, Spirash, the room might still be gone to him afterward, because the objects, voices, and people that made it home had been scattered. Hiding could save the body, while leaving the heart trapped among what had been lost. The underground and those who helped hide people often worked with very little. A false space behind boards, a corner under flooring, a cellar, a workshop crawl space, or a place behind stored materials could become the difference between life and death. The people who prepared such hiding places had to think about air, sound, light, footsteps, and how long a person could remain still. Every small mistake could become fatal. A woman hiding someone might continue her daily tasks. With a hidden person only a few steps away, she might place a pot near the stove, speak calmly to a child, and avoid looking toward the wall where a board had been moved earlier. Her hands might shake when she washed a bowl, but she would keep her body between visitors and the secret place. Courage sometimes looked like doing ordinary things without letting fear change your face. For the person hidden, time became difficult to measure. There was no proper morning or evening, only changes in light, hunger, stiffness, and the sounds outside. He might hear children whisper, a guard shout in the street, or a neighbour crying somewhere nearby. He might want to cough and press a cloth against his mouth until his chest hurts. The hardest sounds were often human ones. Someone is calling a name outside the door. Someone is pleading in the hallway. Someone was ordered to move while furniture scraped, and a child began to cry. A survivor could live because he stayed silent long enough to hear other people taken away. Inside that silence, memory became a duty. He had to remember faces, rooms, voices, occupations, habits, and names because the system outside wanted all of it reduced to absence. If he lived, he might one day have to tell what happened, but in that moment telling was impossible, and memory had to wait inside his closed fist. Survival inside the Minsk Ghetto sometimes meant hiding not only a body behind boards or under floors, but also the last small proof that a family had once lived there. Beyond those hidden rooms, the Nazi system kept bringing more people toward Minsk from other parts of Europe. Trains would arrive with passengers carrying suitcases, coats, and papers from distant cities, still not understanding that the journey had been arranged for death. The trains that came toward Minsk carried people who did not all know the city's streets, its courtyards, or the names of its neighborhoods. Some had come from places far away, from cities where they had once kept apartments, shops, family photographs, winter coats, and papers that still seemed important when they packed them. They had been forced onto a journey that was described through orders, transport, and relocation, but the meaning behind it was much darker. By the time the train reached the Minsk region, many were already exhausted from the road. A man stepping down from a train might still hold a suitcase in one hand. The suitcase could contain clothes folded with care, a document case, a child's spare garment, or a photograph wrapped between shirts so it would not bend. His coat might look like it belonged to another kind of life, a city life with offices, staircases, tram stops, and shop windows. Around him, guards turned arrival into command. Women climbed down with children, pressed close to their sides. Some children held small bags because adults had told them to keep their belongings near, as if their belongings could protect them in a place they did not understand. A mother might look around the platform, searching for signs of where they had been taken, reading faces, uniforms, fences, and the direction people were being pushed. Nothing around her answered like a normal station. Minsk had already become a place of destruction for its own Jewish community, but Nazi policy also connected it to the wider machinery of the Holocaust across Europe. Jews from places such as Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and other occupied or controlled regions were deported to Minsk and the killing site at Maly Trostenets. These arrivals made the tragedy larger than one local ghetto. The rail lines brought other communities into the same system of death. For the deported, the distance made everything more disorienting. They did not know which roads led back to the city, which buildings belonged to the ghetto, which guards were most dangerous, or which faces might offer help. A person from Vienna, Berlin, Prague, or another city could stand on the ground near Minsk and still carry papers from a world that no longer had power to protect him. The old address on a document meant almost nothing here. That loss of meaning was deliberate. The journey stripped people of homes, languages, routines, neighbours, and familiar streets, then delivered them to a place arranged by others. A suitcase that had been packed with thought became a burden. A paper that once proved identity became useless under a system that had already decided the person's fate. A name could travel across Europe and still arrive where no one intended to preserve it. Near the station or transfer point, people might be sorted, ordered, and moved again. Some were pushed toward transport, some toward waiting areas, some toward roads leading away from ordinary public view. The process could look administrative from a distance, with lists, guards, vehicles, and lines. But each orderly step served a crime already planned. The cruelty was not only in the killing, but in how ordinary the movements could appear. A train arrived. People stepped down. Luggage was handled. Guards shouted directions. To anyone who looked only at the surface, it might have seemed like another wartime transport, but the passengers were being carried into a system that treated their arrival as the last stage of removal. For local Jews in Minsk, these deportees were strangers and also mirrors. They showed that the same force destroying the ghetto had reached across borders and pulled other Jewish families from distant cities into the same fate. A person in Minsk could understand that the catastrophe was not confined to one street, one neighbourhood, or one community. It was a whole continent of lives being dragged towards selected places of death. The deported people may have carried accents, clothing, habits, and documents that marked them as coming from elsewhere. Yet once they entered the machinery around Minsk and Maly Trostenets, those differences were meant to be erased. The system cared less about where they had lived than about the fact that they had been marked as Jews. Many roads, many languages, and many family histories were being forced into one violent end. A woman on the platform might still adjust her child's collar out of habit. A man might set a suitcase down to rest his hand for a moment. An elderly person might ask where they were supposed to go next, though the answer had already been decided by people who would not explain it honestly. These small movements make the scene harder to forget because they show people still behaving like travellers when they had been delivered as victims. Minsk became more than a city under occupation. It became part of a network that pulled people from homes across Europe and moved them toward disappearance. The local ghetto, the roads, the rail lines, and Maly Trostenets were tied together by orders, transport, guarded movement, and killing. What arrived by train was not only a group of passengers, but the evidence of how wide the Nazi project of destruction had become. The deportations to Minsk showed that the destruction there reached beyond the local ghetto, drawing Jewish families from distant European cities into the same machinery of death. From the railway arrivals, the story moves toward the killing grounds where Nazi Germany tried to make murder look like organised work. In the forest and fields near Minsk, pits, guards, vehicles and lists would turn human lives into a procedure designed to leave names behind in the dirt. The places outside Minsk did not need signs to become terrifying. A narrow road could lead away from the city. past trees, low ground, and patches of disturbed earth where the forest seemed to close around everything. There might be no proper marker, no public notice, and no words that explained what had happened there. The silence itself carried the weight. A person brought near such a place would have seen little that looked like a battlefield. There were no ruined houses to explain the violence, no front line, no exchange between armies. There were guards, vehicles, ordered movement, and ground prepared for people who had been taken from homes, streets, trains, and ghettos. Murder had been moved away from ordinary view and made into a task. Near Minsk, mass killings included shootings at pits, and killings connected with sites such as Maly Trostenets. Many victims were taken from the Minsk Ghetto, while others had been deported from elsewhere in Europe. The killing did not happen as a sudden accident of war. It was arranged through transport, control, guarded routes, prepared ground, and repeated action. That organization is part of the horror. A shoe left in the mud could say more than a long speech. It might be small, worn at the heel, and partly pressed into wet earth near the edge of a path. Someone once tied it in a room, walked in it through a street, stood in a line wearing it, and carried his own life in the simple act of moving forward. Now it remained where a name should have been. The killers did not only want bodies removed from the living world, they wanted names, families, faces, voices, and histories pushed out of public memory as well. A pit could hide more than death. It could hide the teacher who corrected a child's reading, the mother who divided bread, the tailor who repaired coats, and the old man who knew every step of his courtyard. This is why the ground itself matters in this story. It was not an empty earth. It became a place where a community's traces were forced below sight, where private lives were turned into something the killers hoped no one would be able to separate and name again. The forest covered what city streets had once known. The trees stood over stolen identities. There may have been personal objects scattered nearby, though not all survived or were recorded. A comb, a broken case, a scrap of cloth, a button, or a child's shoe could remain after the person was gone. These were ordinary things, the kind of things people carried without thinking because life had once required them. In a killing place, they became evidence that the victims had not been numbers. The anger in this history should stay clear and steady. It does not need wild language. The facts are already heavy enough. Nazi Germany built a system in which people could be taken from rooms, trains, and streets, brought to places outside public life, and killed in ways meant to erase both the person and the memory of the person. For those who survived elsewhere, the knowledge of these places was difficult to carry. Someone in the ghetto might hear that people had been taken away and never returned. Someone might hear the name of a road, a forest, or Maly Trostenets spoken in a lowered voice. Even when the details were unclear, the fear was not. Families were left with the absence instead of graves they could visit properly. A coat remained on a wall, but the person who had worn it had no marked place beside the family. A name could be remembered at a table, but not always found in a record. The killers had tried to make grief lose its address. That is one of the deeper wounds of mass murder. It does not only end life, it attacks mourning, memory, and the ability of the living to say exactly where their loved ones are. When a person disappears into a pit, a family loses the body, the voice, the final touch, and often the place where grief might kneel. Around Minsk, these sites became part of the wider destruction of Jewish life under Nazi occupation. They connected the local ghetto, deportation trains, guarded vehicles, forced movement, and killing grounds into one system. The road, the list, the guard, the vehicle, the pit, and the silence all belonged to the same crime. It was not chaos wearing a uniform, it was a policy turned into ground. The victims were not nameless because they lacked names. They became harder to name because the system worked to separate them from documents, homes, relatives, and visible graves. That difference matters. The people taken near Minsk had languages, habits, work, families, and rooms they once expected to return to after an ordinary day. The earth could cover bodies, but it could not make those lives meaningless. Every hidden name remained tied to a street, a child, a table, a trade, a prayer, a photograph, or a voice someone once recognized. The work of remembering begins by refusing to let the killing place become only a location. It must also remain a record of people taken from the world. The killing sites around Minsk not only hide the dead, but they tried to bury names, families, voices, and the ordinary lives that had filled a Jewish community. As the war began to turn against Nazi Germany, the killers grew afraid of the evidence left behind in the ground. Men would return to places of murder not to mourn, but to burn papers, disturb graves, threaten witnesses, and make the crime harder to prove. When the war began to turn against Nazi Germany, the killing places around Minsk did not simply fall silent. They entered another stage of cruelty. Papers could be burned, graves disturbed, witnesses threatened, and prisoners still alive placed in even greater danger because they had seen too much. The killers were no longer only trying to destroy people, but also trying to hide what had been done to them. In the forested areas near Minsk, a person could see how fear had shifted inside the system itself. A guard standing near a road might still hold power over the prisoners in front of him, but the larger war was moving closer. The Red Army was advancing, and the men who had once acted as if no one would judge them now had reason to fear discovery. Evidence had become dangerous to the guilty. This did not make them less violent. It made them more careful in a colder way. Documents that had recorded transport, labour, killing and confiscation could be destroyed before others found them. Places of burial could be disturbed, hidden or altered. People who knew details could be silenced. Around Maly Trostenets and other killing sites, the final period of German occupation was tied to efforts to destroy evidence and cover the scale of the crimes. Nazi forces in many places tried to erase traces as Soviet troops approached, including the murder of remaining prisoners and the burning or removal of records. The same system that had organized killing now organized concealment. The crime continued after death. A survivor nearby might understand this without seeing every document or every order. He might see smoke hanging low above trees, guards moving with unusual urgency, or papers carried out and burned in piles. He might notice that certain places were no longer spoken of openly, and that the people forced to work near them returned with faces that looked emptied. Even the air around the site seemed controlled. The horror was not only that people had been killed, it was that the killers wanted to remove proof that those people had been killed in that way, in that place, under those orders. After taking a body from a home, a street, or a train, they wanted to take away the evidence that the taking had happened at all. Murder was followed by an attack on memory. A small personal object left in the dirt could become threatening to them. A shoe, a button, a strip of cloth, or a torn paper might seem meaningless to a soldier, but it could also prove that someone had been there. It could connect a place to a person. It could show that a road, a vehicle, a guard post, and a patch of ground belonged to the same story. This is why attempts to hide crimes were also acts of violence. They were aimed at the dead, but also at the living who might try to remember them. If the evidence vanished, families would have fewer places to mourn, fewer records to search, and fewer ways to say what had happened with certainty. The killers wanted absence to become confusion. In one darkened area, men might move around a site with orders they did not explain. Smoke could rise from paper, wood, or personal belongings. A guard might stand near a path and prevent anyone from coming close, while a prisoner carrying tools kept his eyes lowered and his mouth shut. Looking too long could be dangerous. The witnesses understood the risk of knowing. A person who had seen transports arrive, pits prepared, or victims taken away might realize that his memory itself made him unsafe. The closer the front moved, the more dangerous knowledge became. Those who had survived one stage of terror could be killed because they were still able to speak inside the ghetto. Rumors of these things would not bring comfort. They would only deepen the feeling that the end, when it came, would not be clean or merciful. People still trapped there had already seen rooms emptied, workers selected, children silenced, and families broken apart in the street. Now they could understand that even the truth of those losses was under attack. The German retreat did not undo the crime. It added another layer to it. The people who had planned, guarded, transported, recorded, and killed were now trying to leave behind less for others to find. A system that had treated human life as disposable now treated human evidence as a problem to be removed. For the survivors, this meant memory had to become stronger than the destruction of records. Someone had to remember the road, the smoke, the names, the missing neighbours, the rooms left empty, and the places where people had been taken. In a world where paper could be burned and ground could be disturbed, the human witness became even more important. The truth had to be carried by those who were not meant to remain alive. As Nazi Germany began to fear defeat, the crime around Minsk entered its final cold stage, with papers burned, graves disturbed, witnesses threatened, and evidence treated as something to destroy. Inside the ghetto, the people still alive had to face the last tightening of the same system that had already taken their homes, work, food, and families. The final liquidation would leave workshops, arms, and courtyards nearly empty, while those still standing understood that even obedience had never been a path to safety. By the final days of the Minsk ghetto, the place already looked as if part of it had been emptied before the end arrived. Rooms that had once held several families now had gaps where bedding had been removed or left untouched. Workshops still had tables, tools, scraps of cloth and pieces of wood, but fewer hands were there to use them. The courtyard carried a strange quiet, not because fear had lifted, but because so many voices had already been taken away. A man might stand near a workshop bench and run his fingers over a surface marked by old cuts. He had worked there because work had seemed like one of the few ways to remain useful, and usefulness had once looked like a thin shield. Near him, another person folded a piece of cloth, though there was no clear reason to fold it carefully. Everyone understood that the time bought by labour, silence, obedience, and waiting was running out. The Minsk ghetto was liquidated in 1943 after repeated killings, deportations, roundups, forced labour, and removals. The liquidation was not a sudden break from everything that came before. It was the last stage of a process that had already stripped people of homes, food, privacy, work, relatives, and any stable sense of protection. The final closing of the ghetto only made visible what the whole system had been moving toward. For those still inside, the worst thing was not only the fear of death. It was the collapse of the belief that endurance might be enough. People had followed orders, carried papers, worked when told, kept children quiet, shared rooms, eaten less, and tried not to draw attention. Yet the system had never been designed to reward obedience with life. It had only used obedience to make control easier. In a nearly empty room, a woman might look at the few objects still gathered near the wall: a bundle of clothing, a cooking pot, a bowl with a crack down one side. These things had survived longer than many people had, and that fact felt wrong in a way no one could fix. She might lift the pot, then set it down again, because there was nowhere meaningful to take it. The final days made every sound sharper. A door closing in the corridor could make people turn their heads. A cart outside could pull several faces toward the window. Boots near the gate could stop a conversation before it had formed into words. In the cold light of the courtyard, people stood closer together without saying why. The ghetto had taught them not to trust pauses. A day without violence did not mean safety. A quiet morning could still become a search. A worker sent out before dawn could still fail to return by evening. By this stage, even ordinary waiting felt like a sentence being delayed. In the workshops, the signs of unfinished life remained everywhere. A piece of cloth lay partly cut. A tool rested beside a bench. A cup sat near the place where someone had once taken short breaks between tasks. Work had continued because bodies had been needed. But the people doing that work knew the need could vanish with one order. There was a particular cruelty in the final loss of illusion. Earlier, some had believed a labour card could help. Others had believed that staying quiet, staying useful, or staying unnoticed might carry them through the occupation. These hopes were understandable because people need something to hold while surviving. The liquidation of the ghetto showed how fragile those hopes had always been. A child might stand beside his mother in the courtyard, too tired to ask where they were going. An old man might lean on a wall, his breath slow, his eyes fixed on the ground. A woman might check the knot of a small bag again and again, though everyone knew a bag could not protect anyone from what was coming. The body kept preparing, even when the mind understood there was no safe preparation. By then, the ghetto was no longer only a crowded prison, it was a place being erased in its final form. The rooms, stairs, workshops, and courtyards still existed, but the community that had filled them was being cut away until the spaces remained without the people who had made them meaningful. Minsk itself would still stand after the ghetto was gone, but something inside the city had been destroyed beyond repair. The liquidation closed the last door on those who had been forced to live inside a system of shrinking choices. It took away not only lives, but the final belief that time, work, caution, or endurance might still open a path through the danger. For many, the end did not arrive as a surprise. It arrived as the thing they had feared every day, finally stepping into the room. The liquidation of the Minsk ghetto was the final closing of a trap that had already taken homes, relatives, work, food, and the hope that obedience might protect anyone. When the ghetto was erased, Minsk still had streets, windows, courtyards, and rooms, but the Jewish community that had given those places life had been cut away from the city. In the emptied apartments, bowls, books, coats, and beds would remain behind, while the people who once used them no longer returned to open the door. After the Minsk ghetto was erased, the city did not immediately look empty in the way a field looks empty after harvest. Streets still ran between buildings, windows still caught the grey light, and courtyards still held walls, steps, doors, and patches of hard ground. Someone walking past might see a city that continued to stand, damaged by war, but still made of stone, wood, glass, and smoke-darkened rooms. What was missing could not always be seen from the street. Inside the abandoned apartments, the absence became clearer. A bowl might remain on a table, A coat might hang from a nail, and a book might sit open where a hand had once left it. Dust gathered slowly in the light near the window, covering objects that had outlived the people who used them. The room looked ordinary until one understood that no one was coming back to finish the meal, fold the coat, or close the book. This was one of the terrible truths of an erased community. A city can keep its shape while losing the people who gave many of its places meaning. The walls do not fall just because a family has been murdered. The stairs do not know that the feet that climbed them every morning are gone. The window keeps facing the street. The Holocaust in Minsk not only destroyed individual lives, it broke a Jewish community that had existed through homes, trades, family routines, religious life, friendships, care, memory, and daily work. When that community was torn away, the city did not become visually empty all at once, but its human pattern was damaged in a way no repair could fully undo. Streets remained, but some of the voices that made them alive had been removed forever. A courtyard, after the ghetto's destruction, might just have buckets, broken boards, and marks where people once stood in lines. But the familiar figures were gone. The child who waited near the wall, the old man who leaned by the doorway, the woman who carried water with tired arms, the tailor who crossed the yard with cloth under his coat. All of them had left traces too small for a passing stranger to understand. Their absence had settled into the ground. Rooms became difficult witnesses. A bed could hold the shape of no one. A cup could sit in place without revealing whose fingers had held it. A shelf could keep a few pages, a comb or a folded cloth, but not the voice that had used them. The objects remained patient, while the lives around them had been cut away. For the people who passed through afterward, silence may have seemed like normal wartime ruin. Cities under occupation and war often had broken windows, burned buildings, and empty rooms. But the silence left by the Minsk ghetto was different, because it had been made by policy, by repeated removal, by killings, by deportations, by forced labour, and by final liquidation. It was not just the silence of damage. It was the silence of a community being deliberately taken from its own city. Someone might step into a room and see a child's small garment folded near a blanket. There might be no clear way to know the child's name, whether he had hidden there, slept there, or been carried away from there. A few objects could suggest a life, but not restore it. The room could only offer fragments. This is why the aftermath feels so hollow. The city did not become less real, but it became less whole. Minsk still had streets, shops, doors, and apartment blocks, but part of its memory had been violently removed. A place can continue to exist and still be missing something essential. The people who had lived there had not been temporary shadows. They had raised children, repaired clothes, treated sickness, sheltered food, argued over small things, prayed, worked, and watched seasons pass from those windows. Their lives had been tied to specific rooms and corners. When they were killed, those places lost more than occupants. They lost witnesses to themselves. The emptiness also made forgetting easier for those who wanted to avoid the truth. An empty apartment could be reused, a street could be crossed, a room could be cleaned, but cleaning a room did not erase the fact that a family had once been forced from it, and that the city's ordinary surfaces had been made part of a larger crime. After the ghetto was gone, Minsk carried a hidden wound. It was visible in abandoned belongings, in rooms too quiet, in courtyards where fewer names were spoken, and in the simple fact that so many people who had belonged to the city were no longer there to claim it. The city had not vanished. A piece of its human memory had been hollowed out. After the Minsk ghetto was erased, The city still had streets, rooms, courtyards, books, bowls, and coats. But the Jewish community that had given those places life had been torn away. When the Red Army returned to Minsk, liberation would reveal not only a city freed from German occupation, but also the unbearable absence waiting inside familiar doorways. A survivor could step into an old courtyard, recognize the window and the threshold, and find no family voice left to answer him. When Minsk was liberated in 1944, the city did not simply become whole again. German occupation had ended, and that mattered, but liberation could not fill the rooms that had been emptied before the soldiers arrived. A survivor walking back into an old courtyard might recognize the stone step near the entrance, the window above the stairs, and the place where neighbours once stood with water pails or bundles of laundry. The familiar shape of the place made the absence harder to bear. He might enter through a door that no longer felt like his, even if his hand still remembered the handle. The room inside could be damaged, reused, stripped, or simply left with a few objects no one had bothered to take. A table might stand against the wall, but the meal once shared around it was gone. A window might still open onto the courtyard, but no one leaned out to call his name. Liberation ended the rule of Nazi Germany in Minsk, but it could not undo what had happened to the Jewish community trapped in the ghetto. Most of those who had been confined, starved, used for labour, deported, or taken to killing sites were no longer alive to return. The Red Army could enter the city, flags could change, weapons could fall silent in certain streets, and the occupation could be pushed back. None of that restored a murdered family. For someone returning, victory could feel strangely quiet. He might stand in the yard with dust on his coat and look up at a window he knew from childhood. The glass might be broken or dark, but the frame was still there, holding the outline of a life that had once seemed ordinary. He could remember a mother calling from that window, a child looking down from it, or an old person resting beside it in the warmer months. Now, there was no answer. The grief after liberation was different from the fear inside the ghetto. During the occupation, people had feared doors opening, papers being checked, footsteps in the stairwell, and names being called. After liberation, the danger changed into knowledge. The person standing in the courtyard could finally look around without the same German guard at the gate, but looking only showed him how much had been taken. A survivor might ask about neighbours and receive silence, uncertainty, or a few broken facts. One family had been taken during an action, another had disappeared during the final liquidation. Someone else had tried to escape toward the forest and was never heard from again. The answers were not complete enough to become proper mourning, but they were heavy enough to close the throat. Some rooms still held traces of the people who had lived there. A book on a shelf, a cup with a chipped rim, a torn sleeve left in a corner. These objects could make the return feel almost cruel, because they suggested that the owners had only stepped away for a moment, when in truth the distance was impossible to cross. The city around him might begin moving again. People needed shelter, food, repairs, work, news, and ways to survive the next day. Life after war does not pause politely for grief. A person might have to search for somewhere to sleep, find bread, answer questions, or stand in another line before he had even understood that his family was gone. This made returning feel unfinished. He had reached Minsk, but not home. Home had depended on voices, habits, small arguments, shared meals, and the people who knew where everything belonged. Without them, the old courtyard became a place he could recognize but not fully enter. Liberation could stop an occupation, but it could not reverse erasure. It could open roads, remove guards, and reveal the scale of the crime. Yet it could not put children back at windows or parents back at tables. The Jewish Minsk that had existed before and inside the ghetto had been broken by murder, hunger, deportation, forced labor, and liquidation. What remained was memory standing among ruins. For those who survived, the task after return was not only to live. It was to remember people whom the killers had tried to remove from the city and from the record. A name spoken in a courtyard could matter. A story told at a table could matter. A witness who could still say where someone had lived became part of the fight against disappearance. The liberation of Minsk ended German occupation, but it could not bring back the Jewish families who had been taken from rooms, courtyards, workshops, and streets. From that painful return, the story moves into the work of memory, where survivors' documents and testimonies had to hold what the killers tried to erase. An old hand would rest on a sheet of paper, trying to write down names before age, grief, and silence could take them away a second time. An old survivor could sit at a wooden table long after the war and still find that memory did not come in a straight line. His hand might rest on a sheet of paper with a pencil nearby, an old photograph at the edge of the table, and a lamp throwing weak light across the grain of the wood. He might remember one street clearly, then lose the name of a neighbour for several minutes. The mind kept what it could, but grief had damaged the order of things. He might begin with a family name, then a building, then a courtyard where children once stood close to the wall when carts passed through. A wife's face might come before her full name, or a child's coat before the place where the child had slept. He was not only writing facts, he was trying to pull people back from the silence where the killers had wanted them to remain. Much of what is known about the Minsk Ghetto and the killings connected to it comes through documents, records, research, and the testimony of those who survived. These sources matter because the crime itself was built to remove people from homes, records, streets, and public memory. The ghetto was emptied, killing sites were hidden, and evidence was damaged or destroyed. Without witnesses, much more would have been left in darkness. A survivor's testimony was not just a story about the past. It was a refusal to let the final stage of the crime succeed. Nazi Germany had not only killed people, deported them, starved them, and buried them in hidden places. It had also tried to make their names harder to recover, their homes easier to reuse, and their deaths easier to blur into the general ruin of war. At the table, the old man might write slowly because each name carried weight. He could pause after one word, pressing the pencil harder than necessary, because the face behind it had returned too clearly. Beside him lay a photograph with bent corners, showing people who had once stood together without knowing how valuable that ordinary moment would become. The paper was small, but it held more than any official record could hold. Memory could hurt in practical ways. A survivor might remember the exact stairwell where a family was taken, but not the day. He might remember the sound of boots and a child's sleeve, but not the order shouted outside. He might remember a woman's voice from the next room and still be unable to write her surname. The gaps did not mean the memory was weak. They showed what terror does to memory. Some witnesses gave names, places, routes, dates, fragments of conversations, and descriptions of rooms or actions. Others preserved family stories, kept photographs, or told children what had happened in a voice that could not remain steady. Researchers later worked with these traces, comparing documents, survivor accounts, German records, Soviet materials, and local evidence. Each piece helped rebuild part of what the killers had tried to scatter. Still, testimony was never easy to give. To speak meant returning to stairwells, rooms, courtyards, hunger, searches, transport, and absence. It meant saying aloud that a neighbour was taken, that a child did not return, that a work card failed, that a room was emptied, that a road led away from Minsk and into death. The witness had to carry the dead into words. In a family room after the war, a younger person might listen without knowing where to put his hands. The survivor could point to a photograph and name each face, one by one, even when the listener had never met them. A name spoken at a table became a small act of repair. It did not bring anyone back, but it stopped the silence from taking everything. The work of memory was also a burden placed on the few who remained. Many who could have testified were murdered. Many documents were destroyed. Many rooms that could have held answers were emptied or changed. That meant each surviving voice had to hold more than any one person should have to carry. The old man at the table must stop writing and rub his fingers over his eyes. Not because he was finished, but because remembering required strength. Outside, the city continued with its own post-war life, but on the paper before him, the vanished streets of the ghetto were being rebuilt through names. A person who had once hidden to survive now had to speak, so others would not disappear completely. The survivors of the Minsk Ghetto carried memory as a duty, writing names, places, and fragments of family life against the silence the killers had tried to create. Yet even memory after the war was not simple, because the Jewish victims of Minsk were often folded into broader wartime suffering. Instead of being clearly named for why they were targeted, a memorial could stand in a quiet place, still leave the hardest question unanswered: whether the murdered Jews were being remembered as Jews or only as nameless victims of war. After the war, memories around Minsk often stood in quiet places. A memorial might rise near trees, with cold lettering cut into stone and a few flowers placed at its base by someone who had come before dawn or late in the afternoon. The ground around it could be damp, the path narrow, and the air still enough that even the turning of a paper wrapper around the flowers sounded too sharp. A person standing there could read the inscription and feel both respect and discomfort. The words might speak of victims of war. They might speak of peaceful citizens murdered by fascists. Such word could carry grief, but they did not always carry the whole truth. Behind each general phrase stood the question of whether the Jews of Minsk, murdered because they were Jews, were being remembered with enough clarity. The stone could be solemn and still leave something unnamed. A man might stand before the memorial with a small bunch of flowers wrapped in brown paper. He read the inscription once, then again, because the words were respectful but too broad for the faces he carried in his mind. In his coat pocket he had an old photograph and a folded sheet with names written by hand, names of a child from the stairwell, a tailor from the next room, and a woman who used to share hot water when there was any to spare. The stone remembered victims, but his paper remembered people. In many places that had belonged to the Soviet world, the Holocaust was often remembered inside the wider story of wartime suffering. The dead were sometimes described through broad categories that did not clearly name why Nazi Germany had targeted them. This did not mean the suffering was invented or ignored completely, but it could make the specific murder of Jews harder to see. A visitor could mourn and still not understand exactly who had been destroyed. At a memorial, a survivor might notice that absence physically. His thumb could press against the folded paper in his pocket while his eyes moved over the stone letters. He might remember a doctor with an old medicine bag, a teacher who hid pages, a child who learned to stay silent near the window, and a father who carried documents until the paper nearly tore. None of those people fit comfortably inside one broad phrase. The flowers at the base of the stone mattered. Someone had brought them with care, bent down, and placed them in a way that showed the dead had not been entirely forgotten. A ribbon might be tied around the stems, or a few petals might have fallen onto the wet ground. But even careful mourning can feel incomplete when the words above it not do say clearly who the mourned people were. If this kind of slow, grounded history helps you stay with the human details behind these events, you may like the video and subscribe before we continue toward the final chapters. It helps more viewers find stories told carefully without turning suffering into noise. Now, we return to the difficult work of naming the people behind the silence. A woman might visit such a place carrying an old photograph in a small envelope. The photograph could show 3 people standing in front of a building that no longer looked the same, with one child leaning slightly toward the woman beside him. She might compare the faces in the picture with the words on the memorial and feel that the stone was too still for what it needed to hold. The people in the photograph had names, habits, and rooms. There was also the problem of public language. When victims were named only as citizens or wartime dead, the particular reason for their murder could fade behind larger words. The Jews of Minsk were not killed by accident, by hunger alone, or by the general violence of war alone. They were targeted by Nazi policy as Jews, pushed into the ghetto, starved, used, deported, shot, and erased from the city. That fact needed to remain visible. Still, many families kept clearer memories in private places. At kitchen tables, in notebooks, in testimony, and in quiet conversations, names could survive more directly than they did on stone. A survivor might point to an old street and see who had lived there, who had taught children there, who had mended coats there, and who had vanished from the courtyard. The city map became a list of missing voices. Some names were remembered only by one person: a child from a stairwell, a woman who shared a stove, a man who held a work card at the gate. If that last witness died without speaking, the name could disappear again, not because the person had never existed, but because the chain of memory had been cut too short. This made testimony and naming feel urgent. An old hand writing on paper, a photograph saved in an envelope, a flower placed beneath a memorial, and a survivor stopping before a vague inscription all belonged to the same struggle. The dead needed more than pity. They needed to be recognized as the people they were, and as the Jewish community that Nazi Germany tried to remove from Minsk. By the memorial, the visitor might find Lie taketh the folded sheet from his pocket. He would not correct the stone with a chisel, and he might not speak aloud if others were nearby, but he could read the names quietly to himself, one after another, giving each person a brief return to the air. The forest, the stone, and the flowers stayed still while the names moved through his mouth. That small act mattered, because forgetting does not always look like denial. Sometimes it looks like words that are too broad, incomplete records, or memorials that mourn without naming. The Jews of Minsk had already been erased once by violence. To remember them properly meant refusing to let vague language finish what the killers began. Post-war memory around Minsk could honor wartime victims and still fail to name clearly that Jews had been targeted and murdered because they were Jews. For that reason, the story must now gather the full chain of erasure, not only the deaths, but also the hunger, papers, labour, rooms, roads, pits, and silence that led there. A work card, a bowl of thin soup, a ghetto gate, a road to the forest, and a family photograph would have to be placed together to show how an entire Jewish world was taken apart piece by piece. The destruction of the Jewish community in Minsk cannot be understood through one scene alone. It was not only a street filled during an action, or a road leading out of the city, or a killing place hidden beyond the trees. It was also a work card folded in a pocket, a bowl of thin soup on a small table, a closed gate, a dark stairwell, a child learning not to cry, and an old photograph held too tightly in a hidden space. The erasure happened in layers. A labour paper could decide who stepped through the gate in the morning and who stayed behind waiting. It looked small enough to fit in a hand, but in the ghetto it could carry the weight of a family's hope for one more day. A man might smooth its creases before showing it, knowing that the paper did not save him in any deep sense. It only made him useful for a little longer. A bowl of soup could show another part of the same crime. It might hold more water than food, with a mother stirring it so the children believed something was being prepared. Bread might be divided slowly, not because there was enough, but because careful hands could make hunger look less sudden. The body weakened before the next order arrived. The gate of the ghetto had its own meaning. It separated people from streets they still remembered, from work they no longer controlled, and from a city that had once held their lives. Beyond it, guards decided movement. Inside it, families waited for rumours, lists, labour calls, searches, and the next instruction that might empty another room. A road to the forest could mean escape for a few. It could also mean mud, darkness, informers, dogs, and the fear of knocking on the wrong door. Some people found contact with partisans, and that mattered, because it showed that the community did not only wait in silence. Yet escape remained narrow and dangerous, while most people stayed trapped inside the shrinking world of the ghetto. A road out of Minsk could also lead in another direction. Covered vehicles, guarded movement, and railway transports connected the city to places of killing such as Maly Trostenets. People from the Minsk ghetto and from other parts of Europe were carried into the same machinery. A suitcase, a document, and a city coat could travel all the way to Belarus and still arrive in a place where none of them could protect the person holding them. This is why the story cannot be reduced to gunfire alone. Shooting was part of the murder, but the destruction began before the gun and continued after it. Isolation, hunger, labour, deportation, killing, liquidation, and the destruction of evidence all belong to the same chain. Each step made the next one easier for the killers. In a room after a massacre, a coat might still hang on a nail. In a workshop, a tool might remain beside a bench after the hands that used it were gone. Near a memorial, a visitor might place flowers under words that did not fully name the Jews murdered there. Each object pointed to a different stage of erasure. The community was taken from its houses first, then from its streets, then from its work, food, papers, children, elders, and rooms. Later, parts of its memory had to be rescued from vague language, damaged records, burned, evidence at the passing of witnesses. The attack did not end when the killing ended. A family photograph could hold what the system tried to scatter. It might show people sitting close together, unaware that one day the picture would become evidence of a whole world removed. A survivor might keep it in a drawer, or folded between papers, taking it out only when naming the people in it became necessary. The photograph did not restore life, but it refused emptiness. The same was true of testimony. A name spoken after the war could bring one person back into history for a moment. A street remembered by a survivor could restore the outline of a vanished neighbourhood. A small detail, a coat, a bowl, a stare, a child's silence, could show what a number could not carry by itself. Nazi Germany did not erase the Jewish community of Minsk in one action. It pressed people inward, weakened them, used them, separated them, killed them, hid the evidence, and left memory itself damaged. The city remained on the map, but part of the human life that had belonged to it was torn away. That loss cannot be measured only by counting the dead. To tell the story properly means gathering the pieces and placing them beside one another. The work card belongs beside the soup bowl. The ghetto gate is beside the road to the forest. The railway transport belongs to Maly Trostenets. The memorial stone is beside the old photograph with names written on the back. The destruction of Minsk's Jewish community was not a single act, but a chain of hunger, paperwork, forced labour, deportation, killing grounds, hidden evidence, and memory left incomplete. From that whole chain, the story now returns to Minsk itself. A city that still had streets and winters after the ghetto was gone, but no longer held the same people within them. The final lesson begins with a city still standing under a grey sky, while the families who once filled its rooms, schools, workshops and courtyards are absent from every doorway. After the war, Minsk still had streets, courtyards, windows, stairways and seasons returning over the same ground. Winter could come back to the city, snow could settle on roofs, and people could walk past buildings where families had once cooked, worked, prayed, studied and raised children. From a distance, a city can look as if it has survived because its walls remain upright. But walls do not tell the whole story. The Minsk ghetto shows that the Holocaust was not only the killing of individual people, it was also the destruction of a whole community's place in the world. Jewish families in Minsk were not only taken from life, but from the streets they knew, the rooms they'd lived in, the work they had done, the children they had raised, and the memories they had built over generations. The crime reached into every ordinary part of living. A father with papers in his hand, a mother dividing bread, a child learning silence, a doctor with an empty medicine bag, a tailor bending over worn cloth, and an old survivor trying to write down names after the war all belonged to the same story. None of them was just numbers. They were people inside a city that had once held them as neighbours, workers, parents, children, teachers, patients, friends and witnesses. Nazi Germany tried to turn that living world into an absence. Minsk Ghetto was one of the major ghettos in the Soviet territories under German occupation. Most of the Jews trapped there were murdered during the Holocaust through hunger, forced labour, shootings, deportations, Aktionen, Maly Trostenets, and the final liquidation in 1943. The destruction did not come as one single moment that can be neatly held in the mind. It came as a chain of pressures that tightened until a community could no longer remain. That is what makes this history so difficult to face calmly. The killers did not only pull people from houses and streets. They also took away the idea that work could protect them, that obedience could protect them, that documents could protect them, or that staying quiet could protect their children. Each hope was used for a time, then broken. A city after such a crime can continue to function, doors can open again, new footsteps can cross old courtyards, dust can be swept from rooms, and tables can be moved, repaired or reused. But the people who once gave those places their meaning do not return simply because the city keeps standing. In one apartment, a book might have remained on a table after its reader was gone. In another room, a bowl might have been used by someone else because hunger and cold left little room for untouched grief. A coat might hang on a nail until someone finally took it down, not because memory had faded, but because the living also needed warmth. These ordinary objects show how close the crime stayed to daily life. The lesson of Minsk is not only that murder happened, It is that a community can be dismantled layer by layer until its homes, jobs, children, elders, records, voices, and even public memory are damaged. First, people were isolated. Then they were crowded, starved, used, searched, deported, shot, hidden in pits, and almost buried again under vague words. The erasure did not stop with death. This is why naming matters. The Jewish people of Minsk were not simply lost in war. They were targeted by Nazi Germany because they were Jews, and their community was destroyed as part of the Holocaust. To speak of them only as general victims is to leave part of the truth covered. Respect begins with saying clearly who they were and why they were killed. The story should not end only at Maly Trostenets, or at a ghetto gate, or at an empty room. It should also return to the lives before the destruction. People bought food, mended coats, taught children, treated illness, shared water, argued about small things, watched the weather, and tried to keep families together. They had ordinary lives before history turned ordinary objects into evidence. A family photograph on a table after the war can hold more than a face. It can hold a whole city of missing connections. One person in the picture might have known a shopkeeper, another might have taught a child, another might have carried soup to a neighbour, and another might have stood in the same courtyard on the morning the soldiers came. To remember one person properly is often to remember the world around them. The responsibility left to those who come after is not complicated, but it is serious. We have to remember the victims as people, not as shadows behind a number. We have to remember the places where they lived, not only the places where they died. We have to refuse the kind of forgetting that allows a community to be erased twice. Minsk still stands, but the Jewish community destroyed there cannot be returned to its streets. What can be returned is attention, names, accuracy, and the quiet refusal to let the killers decide how little remains. The story of the Minsk Ghetto is a warning about what happens when a state turns neighbours into targets, paperwork into a weapon, hunger into policy, and memory into something that must be fought for. So we leave this story not with a simple ending, but with a city under a grey sky, with empty windows, old photographs, memorial ground, and names that still need to be spoken carefully. The people of the Minsk Ghetto were not only victims of a massacre, but members of a Jewish community that Nazi Germany tried to remove from life, from the city, and from memory. To remember them is to keep one final door from closing. Thank you for staying with this difficult history until the end, and for giving these lives the quiet attention they deserve. May the names, rooms, streets, and families of Minsk remain more than a forgotten number in the dark. Rest well, take care, and good night.